So today we're going to talk about materials. We're going to step aside from our little building for now, and I'm going to go through the fundamentals of material setup, things, basic stuff you need to be aware of when you're working with materials in 3D, and how you link up your textures and all that sort of stuff. So this is more of I wouldn't call it a theory thing, but it's more of a theory that will be applied to our model once we get back into it. So we might touch on our model this afternoon after we talk about this material stuff. But yeah, this is super important things to know about your lighting, how to set up things to look nice and clean and stylized and all that sort of shit. So yeah, let's go and do that. So not sure how many people are in here today, but that's all right. Thank you for coming. For those who are here, so let's get started. So this is from last week. I was just playing around with the camera, but let's open up a new Blender and let's talk about materials. So I'm going to keep the light and keep this camera. I'm going to delete this cube for now and create a plane. And then I'm just going to add 3 or 4 spheres, sorry. So, because today we're talking all about materials. So I'm going to add one there, duplicate, slide it across. And if you want to repeat the process, you push Shift R and you can actually keep the process going. So Shift R lets you repeat actions basically. And then I'm going to select all those spheres and then turn on smooth shading. And we're going to use this as our sort of platform to play with lights and materials. So I may switch between different rendering engines as well, because I want to talk about that as well. But for now, let's just go straight into the materials and lighting and stuff like that. So when it comes to materials, there's a few things you should be aware of, especially with the principles of how to set up materials and how that relates to textures. So a lot of people confuse a material with a texture and vice versa, when in fact they're actually quite different things. So a texture is basically an image that you attach to a material to give it that texture. And a material is basically a node or a piece of information that you assign to the objects in your scene to have that particular material property. So a material doesn't need to have textures in order to work. So I'm going to demonstrate that today. But first, let's talk about materials before we jump into the texture thing, and talk about I guess the standard sort of workflow for materials in modern render engines. And let's jump into I'm going to draw a little diagram to talk about what this all means. So let me load up just any old picture editing software. All right, so when it comes to setting up any old material in a 3D sense, you need to be aware of one, what kind of render engine you're using. So usually in most 3D softwares besides Blender, if you're using a rendering engine, a render engine is basically what renders your images, right, from 3D. And a render engine has its own material setup. I guess you can call it a material engine, right? And from in there, you create materials. And in this case, you can have multiple materials. So you can have, a number of materials. And each of these materials have particular properties. Sorry. Should have made too many of these. All right, I'm just going to erase that one. And now, with these materials, these can be assigned to objects. So oops, I'm going dyslexic. And the interesting thing about materials themselves, you can assign them to, an object can take on multiple materials. So you can have this one or this one. You can have a single material from that one. You can have one like that. Or you can have like every material on the same object, depending on how you assign it. Now, usually with the materials, they are sort of locked to the render engine. So you can't go to another render engine and use the same materials. You have to actually edit them to work with that render engine. So for instance, render engines come in different flavors. So for instance, you can have, cycles, which is the ray tracing version in Blender. You can have Eevee, which is the screen space renderer. And they equal the same thing. They're not the same thing, but they do things, similar things differently. And the nice thing about Blender is that they can work together. So luckily with Blender and its two different render engines, you can actually pipe in the same material engine. They actually work within the same material engine. But in, say, if you were to use another render engine such as Octane, so Octane is a proprietary engine. You have to pay for it. You can't instantly use Octane with your with materials that you've already made in, say, Cycles or Eevee. You actually have to they have to actually create their own materials because it has its own material engine and it operates differently. So if you're working in, say, Maya or 3ds Max and you're using, say, Arnold or whatever, and you want to switch over to, say, Blender with the same models, you'll have to recreate your materials for your particular render engine. So that's worth noting. All right. So with that in mind, we have the material. The way you build materials is done in a particular way. So in Cycles and Eevee, it's using a principle known as PBR. So that stands for physical based rendering. Right? And with that in mind, physical-based rendering is basically just a term used for the style of render engine regarding the way it reacts to light. So it uses the physical properties of the real world to replicate materials in 3D. In the past, you had to make like do different kind of tricks and cheats to make it look like the realistic renders that you'd get in, say, your old movies from the 90s and early 2000s, and that kind of shifted in the mid 2000s with this rendering system. But basically, there's a few things that PBR render engines all have in common. They all use a roughness metallic sort of dynamic. So basically you can make things glossy to rough. Using this to roughness, and you can have a metallic operator. Basically, it shifts the material from a from a dielectric to a non-dielectric material. So basically, a metallic to non-metallic, and it changes the way that the light reacts to that particular material. And there's more to it than this, but basically this is one of the biggest things related to PBR texturing, and that in the past you had to mix multiple materials to get a metallic object or a smooth object or a rough object. Nowadays you just kind of have to play with the single material node to put in the right sort of information into that node to get a sort of mix between metallic, roughness, and all sort of stuff. So that's really, really important. So let's jump into our 3D scene and let's demonstrate that. But we have to set up a few things first. So in this case, we're going to work with Eevee for now, but let's turn on a few things in the rendering engine first. So Eevee is our render engine that we're going to use. Let's just go to our viewport shading mode for now. And we're just going to use a basic HDRI just for that. And we're going to turn on our ambient occlusion. We're going to increase the distance so we can see a little bit of shadowing. So I'm going to give it around 2 meters. We're going to turn on bloom just because it looks nice. Increase that threshold a little bit. We're going to turn on screen space reflections. So we'll talk about that soon, but we have to turn on refraction as well as we talk about glass and all that sort of stuff. And we're just going to turn on soft shadows and height bit depth. So just so it looks a bit cleaner. And we'll turn on in the render settings for our preview. We're going to turn on scene lights just so we can see our light do its thing. All right. So let's add materials to these objects. So let's add a new material to each of these spheres with a different name and number. So to add a material, we select our object. We can go to our material tab at the bottom. And then we push new. And that creates a new material node. And we'll get into that in a second. So let's rename this as, we'll just call it material 1. We're only working with the one thing anyway. And we'll do the same thing for the next one, new material. And as you can see, that Blender creates a new name and it's basically doing it in order of 1, 2, 3. So we're going to add a new material to each one of these. All right. And it's worth noting that when you create a material, it actually creates a material node. And material nodes can be accessed in the material node window. So if you look down here, the shader editor, and that actually creates this thing, a material node. And you can move that around inside that space. But basically, when you start getting into more complicated materials, the material node editor is your basically the gateway to creating some really awesome materials. So with this, I'm going to keep this open just so you can see what's happening. And notice how this node is actually representing the same information in the side panel here. So you can actually play with it in both sides. And notice how we have our roughness and metallic options here as well. Now let's give each one of these a different color. So we can give this a different color. So base color in other software or other render engines, this would be called a diffuse input, but we can call it's just base color in Blender. But this is where you'd put your basic texture input in Blender. But let's just give it any old color. So I'm gonna give it a red color. Give this one a blue color. Give this one a green color. Yellow. I'm just going to go around the spectrum. And I'll make that one white. And I'll keep that one white for a reason as we get into things. So let's start with our basic settings with our our sphere. So with this material, let's talk about roughness. So roughness is basically how shiny an object is. And let's see if everyone's keeping track. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them as well. We have plenty of time to talk about this stuff. But let's talk about the roughness first. So one of the most common things you'll be editing in a material is the roughness. So the roughness is basically the glossiness of an object or reflectivity. So if we play with the roughness, see what happens. So if I go backwards to 0.1, it gets glossier and glossier and glossier. If I go forward, it gets rougher and more diffuse, as they say. It basically becomes like a non-reflective surface. So let's see how that looks at 0, and how that looks at 1. 0 and 1. And if we turn on, let's just turn on a few things on the light. So I'm going to turn on in the light. I'm going to turn on contact shadows as well. Just adds a little bit of depth to that as well. So let's keep that one as 100% rough. And now look what happens when I put this down to 0%. So now that's fully glossy. And now with this one, let's talk about metallic. So metallic basically shifts the way that light reacts to that object. So if I turn this up to 1, see how it changes the way that light reacts to it? It becomes more and more metallic. And then you can combine your metallics and your roughness to get different properties as well. So let's bring that one up to fully metallic, but let's bring the roughness down to 0. And you can see it's still metallic. It looks like a mirror, but the way it's reflecting light is different because it's interpreting the way that light reacts to metals rather than to non-metallics. So generally speaking, when you're working with textures and building up complicated textures and all that sort of stuff, usually the number of the metallic value is either 0 or 1, because in nature, you can't have a 50% metallic thing. That's why the periodic table has metallic elements and non-metallic elements as two separate things. You can't really have a half metallic object in real life. So generally speaking, you could jump between 0 and 1 when it comes to metallics. It changes a little bit different when we start texturing, but generally speaking, when you look at a metallic texture map, and we'll get into that soon, you'll understand that when you look at the texture map, it's usually just black and white. There's no gray or anything like that. It's just straight up black and white because it's replicating metallic and non-metallic elements. So let's look at this one now. Let's pump the metallic up to 100% and just bring the roughness up as well. And this one looks a little bit weird because it's still metallic, but it's got a super diffuse nature to it. And generally speaking, I try to avoid this because it doesn't really look that good. But you can see how you can manipulate multiple inputs on a texture, on a material node as we get into that. And then finally, we have transmission. So transmission is basically your glass. So you can actually create a transparent object in 3D just in the same material by changing the way its transmission is. So transmission basically allows light to pass through it. Now you may be seeing that looks a bit rough still, but if we bring down the roughness, you'll see it becomes more like a glass. And you're starting to see some limitations with Eevee in that it's a screen space renderer. So basically it's basically creating some sort of light tricks to create that glass. But in Eevee itself, we need to turn on one little function in that material to make it act completely like glass. And that is to turn on screen space refraction. So it's basically simulating that lensing effect with the glass. So it allows you to see through the glass object. And of course, you know, this stuff reacts to light. So all these materials react to light in certain ways. You can see you can see the actual light reflecting in the object there when you have roughness turned down to 0. But here it's more like a dispersed light. So it's actually dispersing the light and making it sort of bend around the object a lot more softly. Look at the material in the metal. You can see it looks metallic. It feels metallic as well. And then you can see it here. It's basically mirroring that light as it comes into the into view. And again, because this is so diffuse, you're barely getting any sort of like, you're getting a very light gradation of light. And of course, with the sphere with the glass shader, it's basically just reflecting completely. And of course, you can turn up the roughness on this as well to get sort of like a frosted glass effect. So that looks kind of cool. But look what happens when I turn it into a metal. It basically becomes a mirror again. And it doesn't really it's not really affected by the glass transmission. And that's because glass, as it stands, isn't really a metal. I mean, it's glass. Yeah. So because we're shifting the metallic from a non-metallic to a metallic, the metallic overrides the property of the transmission. So if we go inside it, you can see it's still just basically reflecting all light. So let's bring that back down. You also have transmission roughness as well. So, but it doesn't really, it's not really affected by in Eevee that much. So generally speaking, in Eevee, when you're working with a glass shader, you basically just have transmission set to 0 to 1. You have screen space refraction turned on in the actual material settings, and then you have, you know, your roughness settings here as well. Now, the cool thing about 3D materials is that you can mix and match them. So you can actually add multiple materials to a single object. So hopefully everyone's following. So the image that's reflecting the spheres is Blender's default HDRI. So we'll talk about that in a second. But basically, it's creating a light map, like an inbuilt light map to simulate the reflection. So Blender has those inbuilt. And that's why you're getting that reflection of those trees. And I'll teach you how to bring your own HDRIs into the scene once we talk about these materials. Because right now we're in viewport shading. We're just in like a preview, material preview. Whereas if you go to rendered, you'll see that it looks completely different. And the reason why it looks completely different is because the actual scene has no actual light information apart from this one light. And the world settings. So the world settings has a slight gray to it, so there's a little bit of light coming in from the world. But if I bring that down to 0, it's basically darkness. But we'll talk about bringing in extra light into this scene once we talk about the materials and how to set those up. Yeah, cool. So now let's talk about how we can mix and match materials. So I'm going to copy these spheres. I'm just going to duplicate them and shift them across a little bit here. And I want to add this material, half of this material, to this circle. So I want to actually have the red on the bottom and the blue on the top. So to do that, there's a few ways, but we'll talk about the simplest way at the moment, which is to actually combine two materials to the same object. So you actually assign materials to the same object. So let's add a new, so to do that, we select our object and we push this little plus icon and we add a new material slot. And as you can see, it's empty, nothing's happening, but we do have the library of materials in this scene. So to add that material to this scene, we push this little button and we browse for our material. So I want to choose my blue material and it comes up in the node editor. But look how nothing has really happened on the sphere. We need to assign this material to particular faces of this sphere to get this material property to this sphere. So to do that, we jump into edit mode. And then we basically select the faces that we want to be assigned with that blue material. So I'm just going to assign the top. Let me just turn on that as well. So I assign that I can select the top faces, and then if I push assign, it's now added those selected faces to that material. And you can add as many as you like. So for instance, with this sphere, I can add basically every material I want. So let's play with that. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 materials. Let's add 4 more slots. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to add the red one, the green one, the yellow one, and I might skip the pink one because it looks ugly. I'm going to select the glass one. All right, so let's jump into our edit mode again. And in this case, I'm just going to do strips. So I'm going to do strips of the red one, strips of the green one, strips of the yellow one, and this would be interesting, the glass one. We'll add some strips of that one too. And look how that works. So you can actually add multiple materials to one object. And if you want to delete them, so let me just show you how that works. So I'm just going to add another one to this one. Add a new slot. And you can add new slots in edit mode too. So with this one, if you want to remove a material, you basically can just remove the slot like so, or you can unassign it. So if you don't want to get rid of the material in the objects library, we can just assign the green back onto that object like so. And of course, because it's actually using the same material across multiple objects, that means we can just play with the one material property to affect all these objects at the same time. So if I want to make this rougher, I can. Like so. And now there's a few, let's get into a few more fancy features. We may need a fancier object to pull this off. So let's create a monkey. So we're going to add a monkey, and we're going to bring that up, and I might put that in the center. So this is some extra stuff you can be aware of when working with materials, because there's more than just roughness, metallic, and transmission to play with. There's another thing called subsurface scattering, and this is what makes you get that and this is what gets you that fleshy look when you like do skin and all that sort of stuff. So select my monkey. I'm going to add a subdivision modifier, and then I'm just going to smooth that out. So I have a nice smooth material. I'm going to bring that light into view here, and then I'm going to add a sort of skin-like material. So I'm going to push new. So I have a nice new material. I'm going to go straight down. I'm going to scroll right down and turn on subsurface translucency. I'm going to turn on screen space refraction. Actually, I'll turn that off. Keep that off, sorry. And in the render settings, I'm just going to make sure that subsurface scattering is turned on. So make sure that's on. So that's on there. Now, let's add a sort of natural colored skin to this thing. So in the material settings for this one, let's give it like a sort of, I'm just going to give it an orange color. Now, there's another option in the principled shader called subsurface. And subsurface basically is sort of like light that is refracting inside an object. It's sort of bouncing around and creating that sort of softness that waxy feature that you get from candles, or when you put a light to your hand, you can see through it with those sort of red undertones. So that's done with the subsurface setting. And notice how if I crank it up, it goes a bit waxy. And it doesn't take much to do it either. So you can see, you can play with that quite a lot. And then you have the subsurface color. So if you want to have it sort of like that warmish feeling of like blood rushing underneath the figure, you can make it pink. Increase that subsurface, and you get that sort of waxy undertone. And look what happens when I put a light behind that ear. So I'm going to put a light behind that ear. I'm going to turn off that blue so you can see what's going on a bit more clearly. See how when I bring light closer to that ear, you get that sort of warm, waxy feature? That's subsurface scattering. And you can bring the light inside the actual object as well, and you get that same sort of effect. Where like the thicker the part of the objects are, the less light flows through it. And you can make that light a bit weaker. So I'll make that light weaker. Let's make it like 300, maybe less. And the way that we affect the subsurface is by changing the way it reacts to it. And you can see just by moving that around, you get that sort of really weird, but really satisfying look to your objects. So if you're doing like characters and stuff, and you want to have a sort of like that soft Pixar style lit skin, this is the function you have to turn on. So all these things can be combined in different ways. So if I wanted to, for instance, on this red material, I can add that subsurface radius to soften that up a little bit. Change that color. And the color, the undertone actually affects it too. So yeah, just to give you an idea. But yeah, you can see how much easier it is to add materials and textures together. Not textures, just materials to create that sort of effect. But what about using textures to do the same thing? So let's play with that. So I'm going to move all these spheres back in my scene. And now we're going to play with adding textures to our objects. So let me just bring that head back and move that light. So textures can be used for everything, much more than you think. So rather than just being for like the base color, you can actually use textures to affect the metallic, the roughness, the transmission. Everything you see on this node you can use with textures. And I'm going to show you how that works. But first we need to find some textures. And we need to find some free textures at that, because fuck paying for shit. We're learning. So there's some really great online repositories for textures. The most well-known, I'm going to save this by the way. One of the most well-known repositories is called Texture Haven. So let's jump into Texture Haven and see what we mean by that. So let's just jump in, go to texturehaven.com. And you'll see this website. And it also has a thing called HDRI Haven, and we'll talk about that soon as well. So if we go to textures, you'll see there's all kinds of textures available to download, to play with. And let's play with some basic textures. So I'm going to go with, let's try this leather one, actually. And you can see it has maps you can download. So you will notice that it's following the same PBR principles of diffuse, roughness, and metallics if it had metallics. So we'll talk about I'll download this one, and you can download the resolution. So I'm just going to click a 2K package. 2K is the resolution, so 2048 by 2048. I'm going to save that to my folder. Let's have a look. Where did I put it? Live stream. All right, I'm going to put that there. I'm going to go back. I'm going to find a metal one too. And you'll see that the metallics come with they should come with a metallic map as well. So we can play with that. And sometimes it's called specular. So we can use that as well. So let's download this one as well. 2K. Save file. And we'll download that too. And let's download one more. Let's see. If not, we can play with it in a different way. All right. So let's go back to our scene. I'm going to create a cube. Bring back that cube. The reason I'm using the cube in this case is because it has UV maps already done on it. So we'll talk about that probably next week as well. UV maps, it's a whole different game. And I've got 2 cubes, one for that leather and one for that metallic. So let's add a new material first, and then we're going to unzip those images. So let's go to our desktop, open up the Livestream folder, and I'm going to make a new folder and call it textures. I'm going to put those in there, and it's always good to have a nice organized project folder for all your stuff, including your textures. So I'm going to extract all those, and I'm going to extract all of these ones as well. All right, so we've got those extracted. Now we can add them to our materials. So there's 2 ways you can do that in Blender. So you can push this little button here on the side panel, and you can click on image texture, add, and then watch what happens when I push image texture in the node editor. It creates a new node to add an image texture. Another way that's a lot easier, and it's to do with using it inside the principal shader, inside the node editor, is to push Shift-A, texture. So you get like a list of different things you can add in the node, in the this sort of layout, texture, image texture, and you can add it in like so. And then you have to feed it in with this little node picker. So you click on the little yellow dot and you hook it in like so. And as you can see, it's turning black for now because we haven't actually added a texture file to this node. There's a third way we can do it, and it'll make life even easier, is to turn on an add-on called Node Wrangler. So to do that, go to your preferences, type in the add-ons folder, type in Node Wrangler, and turn that on. And what it does, it basically does preset sort of texture setups for you. So basically, if I click on this object here, this node, and push Control-T, it actually does link up everything I need to link up straight away. Anyway, moving on. Now we need to add an image texture to this node. So to do that, I just push Open. I go to my texture folder. I'm going to make this one the fabric leather, and add. So if we turn on the thumbnails, you'll see that the leather has a bunch of different maps. So we have our diffuse, we have displacement, we have roughness, we have ambient occlusion. We haven't talked about that much, but we're not really going to touch on that one. And we have a normal map, and we'll talk about the normal map with this as well. So to add the diffuse, we click on this diffuse color, we push Open Image, and you can see that it has the leather texture, but it doesn't look very leathery right now, right? That's because we have to add the extra textures to this to give it that full leather look. So to do that, we have to add a duplicate node and then feed in the roughness. So we can actually duplicate that node. And then we have to put in this mapping node. So we'll talk about that mapping node in a second. So we feed in this mapping node into this one. And now we have to switch out the texture on this one. So we're going to add the roughness to this node. Now I'm going to disconnect this briefly to show you how the roughness works. So if we feed in the roughness, make sure that it's black and white, by the way. So because it's a black and white image, we need to set the color space for this image to be black and white. So in this case, it's just called non-color. So to switch it to non-color, and there you go. And the black and white values represent a value of 0 to 1. So if I preview this, I'm just going to preview this by pushing Control-Shift click. You'll see that it's black and white. So the white areas will become the value of 1, and the black areas will represent a value of like 0, or just a bit above 0. So the black parts are the shiny parts, and the white parts are the non-shiny parts. But look what happens once we feed that in. So I'm going to delete that. Look what happens when we feed that into the roughness. So I'm going to feed that in. I'll make sure that this is plugged in as well. If I look carefully, if I change the color, you can see how the roughness of that leather come through. Let's have a look. Let's bring that light in closer. I'll make that a darker color just so you can see it happening. Notice how it's taking on the reflectivity of that leather right now. Isn't that cool? And now if we add in the leather, this diffuse, it's going to have that leathery look so far. So it's looking better already, but it's still looking a little bit flat. So you can see the reflection happening there. What we need to do is add a little bit of bump. So bump is the bump, like add the bumpiness to this material. So like, leather has a bit of bumpiness to it. We need to simulate that with a texture map. And you can do that in two ways. One with a bump map, which is similar to the roughness map. It's black and white. It represents height values from 0 to 1. Or we can use a normal map, which is a more complicated, more advanced sort of version of the bump map. But we need to add a few more things to this texture to do that first. So first, we need to add a normal input. So we push Shift A to bring up the search. And if we go to vector on this list and select normal map, you'll get this net thing here. And we have to feed in our texture into this normal map, and then this normal map goes into this node here. So I'm going to duplicate this fabric. I'm going to duplicate that. And this time I'm going to choose this normal map. See how it's a different color from like blue and purpley? It's actually representing height values and light direction and all sort of stuff. So look what happens once we add it into the image. So I'm going to push this. I'm going to bring that feed into here, and you'll understand what I mean by this, how this is important once we get everything connected up. And I'm going to switch this to non-color as well. It's just the way that Blender interprets it. So non-color. We feed in the color into this normal map color input. And then this normal map goes into our normal input here. Processes, and look at that. It's actually representing the bumpiness of the leather. And you can see the light is actually reflecting on the stitching and all sort of stuff. Isn't that awesome? And we can soften that up by adding, maybe a subdivision surface to make it look a bit more leathery. 1, 2, 3. Oops, 1, 2. Let's see. Actually, let's add a bevel first. Let's add a bevel. In the modifiers, I'm going to smooth shade that. And you can see it looks really leathery now. Like wet leather, but leathery nonetheless. So now let's do the same thing, but this time we'll do it with a metallic object. So I'm going to bring that light over here. I'm going to add that bevel as well on this one. And smooth shade that. And we're going to add a new material. So I've got our material here. And this time I'm going to do a little trick with the node wrangler. So instead of manually linking up all these materials myself. I'm going to use let Node Wrangler do it for me. I'm going to click on this and push Control Shift T. Oops, sorry, cancel. Control Shift T. And what this does, it actually links up all the appropriate materials for me, textures for me without blinking. So it actually detects the names of the different files. So in this case, I have specular, I have the diffuse, we have the normal, and then we have the roughness. So I'm going to select this one, the diffuse, the roughness, the specular, and the normal. And push principal texture setup, and look what happens. Like magic, it detects where all these different things go to. So it has screwed up a little bit, I think. It got it wrong a little bit, so it added the diffuse in the metallic. In this case, we need to change the specular to metallic. So let's have a look. And let me show you how that specular map looks, by the way, to reiterate what that means. So see how it has black and white values again. So if we feed that into the metallic instead of the specular and feed that back into the surface, you can see that it's only adding the metallic to the parts that aren't painted. And we can change that roughness with a few extra things. We can make it less shiny and all sort of stuff by adding some extra nodes in between. But you can see what I mean. By adding a roughness or specular map to the metallic input, one part is non-metallic and the other part is metallic. And because of that roughness map, the metallic is far shinier than the painted area. So you can get some really cool effects. And of course the bump is adding that illusion of like those metallic bits popping up and appearing as if they're like, you know, sticking out. But the thing is that the actual object, if I duplicate this and remove that material, it's just a plain cube. So by using null maps, roughness maps, metallic maps, and diffuse maps, you can get the illusion of depth very easily just with textures. Now, I promised I was going to talk about the this mapping node and what that means. So what the mapping node, when you have them all hooked up into these textures, it allows you to scale up and down the texture. So you can actually make the scale of the texture smaller or larger by changing the scale in this mapping node. And it's linked to this texture, it's related to these texture coordinates. So because we have UVs on this thing, basically if I go into my UV editor and click on that cube, let me go into that cube, go into my UV editor, it's unwrapped that box like a little cardboard box. You'll see if I select everything. It knows that because of the UVs, where to project that texture. So we'll talk about that next week a little bit more. Or maybe with the room, we might add a floor texture to our room just to cap off this this live stream. All right. So we can actually scale this up and down by scaling up and down this mapping node. So look what happens when I increase the scale of that texture node. It's actually scaling these textures on that cube. So if I wanted to have even more detail, more of these pattern popping up, I can increase it even further, 3. If I want it to be even less, I can bring it back down to 0.5. And this becomes really important when you're trying to get the right scale for a texture for a particular item in our room. And we'll demonstrate that with our floor, I think. I'll do that before we wrap up today. So I'm going to keep it at like 4. So you can see it looks like a real plated box, doesn't it? And it works with everything. So it can work with this leather as well. So if I change the scale of this leather, you can see it's a lot smaller now. And it can even move the way that the texture is in this space. So if I want to move the way that these seams are, you can actually change the location, inverted commas, of these texture. So it's usually just X and Y because texture is only in X and Y. So I can change the way it moves the texture. We can actually animate this if you wanted to as well. You can change the placement of that texture. Like so. And I'm going to do one more thing to demonstrate the roughness and stuff like that, because you can make your own custom texture maps in Blender to utilize the roughness and the roughness, metallics, and all that sort of stuff. So let's do that with a bit of texture painting. So I'm going to add a new material. I'm going to give it a color. I'm just going to leave it at that for now. I'm going to go into this material node here, and I'm going to add my own custom textures. So I'm going to make my own textures for this thing here. So to add your own texture, we need to create a texture in Blender. So to do that, I'm just going to make a new window. Sorry, oopsie, accidentally closed it. So we can make a new texture by going to the texture paint, the texture paint section of Blender. So we can actually just go to this tab and it'll create a workspace for us to play with. And obviously I want to switch back into viewport shading just so I can see what I'm doing. And I need to create a new texture. So I'm going to create a new texture. I'm going to give it a name. In this case, I'm going to give it a roughness. I'll just call it roughness. Roughness. And push OK. I'm going to keep it black for now. Alright, so I need to hook up this texture. First things first, we'll have to save it as well. So I'm going to save this texture. Just make sure that you save it first. I'm going to save it as roughness. And now I'm going to hook up this black texture to my cube. And look what happens when I do that. So I'm going to open up a shader editor node. I'm going to create a new texture input. So texture, I'm going to add an image texture. And because Blender knows what this is in the library of Blender, I can just go to this little tab here and click on roughness. And look what happens when I hook up just this plain black roughness map into my cube. It goes completely glossy. I'm going to turn on scene lights as well. Now, I may want to make only parts of this thing glossy. And to do that, I just use a white brush, which represents a value of 1 to equal extra roughness in my texture map. So I can do that in the texture paint window. So I got my texture paint open here, and I can just start painting straight away directly on this roughness map, or I can paint inside here. So look what happens when I start painting on the cube with a white map. So obviously it's the same map that I'm painting on in here and in here, but notice how it's gone rougher. So you can actually make your own roughness maps and all sorts of stuff in Blender. But I can also make a metallic map. So first things, I need to save this image, so I need to save it again. So I push save, so it saves it and keeps referencing in that image. I'm going to make a new texture and I'll call it metallic. So in this case, I'm going to add a new one, new image, call it metallic. And I'm going to save that as a new image, save as. It's called metallic.png. And again, it's black, but I need to add that into my scene. So I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to add a metallic, the metallic node, and then put that into my metallic. And as you can see, because it's a value of 0, it has no metallic going on. But if I paint on this metallic node now, directly onto that metallic node, so make sure I've got the right map selected. So I'm going to give it, select that metallic node, and you can see it's starting to get metallic. You can see that metallic popping up here. And you can mix and match, so you can have metallic and roughness on top of each other. So I have rough metallic and glossy metallic going in there. And you can just keep on doing that to your heart's content, basically. Now the normal map's a little bit trickier, but we can do it with a bump map as well. We can add bumpiness to this thing by adding a bump map instead of a normal map. So I'm going to add a new one more. And I say that as, make a new one. And I'll call this one bump. I'm going to save that as a new one. Save as. Bump. Save as. And then I'm going to duplicate this again. But this time I need to add a bump node instead of a normal node. So bump node. And this will go into, so I'll push, I'm going to push on my bump. Type it in so I can find it. There it is. Bump. Add the color to the height. So the color, the black and white value, represents the height. Make that non-color. And now I feed that into the normal. And nothing's really going to happen until we start painting. So let's paint on this bump map. All right. So in this case, I may have to paint directly on the texture node here. So with that in mind, let's start painting. And look what's happening. It's adding bump to that texture map. So the illusion of depth. Now that's one ugly looking cube, but it really helps hammer home what you can do with these different maps to change up that material, that base material. Isn't that crazy? So yeah, that's how you can play with all kinds of stuff with materials. Now, in that case, let's go back to our room and add a floor, like some floorboards to our scene. So let's see if I have any questions. So we have a few minutes to go. I'll go over by a few minutes just so you guys can see this happening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask before we wrap up. But yeah, let's jump into our bedroom. Not bedroom, our little dining room. So I've got my little room here. I added a floor plane to this thing before the live stream just to use it as a thumbnail. But we have our little floor here. It's super plain, nothing's fancy. So let's add some fancy floorboards to this thing. So we'll go back to our textures. I'm going to go down to floor. If there's any floor, yep, there's a floor node here. Now let's try and find something like floorboards. Hopefully they have any. I'm not sure if they do. But if not, we can use tiles. Or maybe the wood section has it. Fuck it. Let's just go with some tiled floors for today. Let's try and find something that looks a bit nice though. Let's go with this marble. I think that will be the best one for now. Let's click on this marble. And add, actually, let's go with this floor tiles here, this black and white marble floor tile. I'm going to download all the maps. I'll make it 2K as well, PNG. Save file. Put it in my textures folder. And I'm just going to unzip that. Extract all. Alright, so we've got that all sorted, all good to go. Alright, so let's just add some floor tiles to this thing. So we're just going to go into my shader editor. And because we already have a material here for the floor, we don't need to make a new one. So I just need to add those floor materials, texture maps to this floor. So I'm going to do the same thing with the node wrangler, Control-Shift-T. I'm going to go to my textures. I'm going to go to my floor. And I'm going to select the diffuse, the normal map, the roughness, and I'm going to leave it at that. And I push principal texture setup, and you can see I've added my floor tiles to that thing. And now I might just increase the scale of those with the mapping node. So I'm going to give it a scale 3. And you can see that we've added some textured tiles to that floorboard. And here's another issue before we wrap up here. Notice how the tiles aren't perfectly square. And that's probably because our UVs haven't been settled properly. So for instance, we'll talk about UVs next week, but to fix that for now, we're just going to go switch out the UV input from UV to generated. And hopefully that will work. If that doesn't work, then we'll just have to unwrap it. All right, so let's quickly unwrap this thing, just quickly. So just select on that floorboard. I'm going to go into edit mode, select everything and push U, and then put, U, and push unwrap. And that will fix that up for now. And then we have a bit of a textured floor. So that's all good. All right, so before we wrap up, I want to talk about those that lighting question we were talking about before in this scene. So you can see here that it's well lit in this material preview, but when we go to our rendered preview, it looks really dark. And that's because the only light we have in this scene is these lights here. Whereas in the material preview, because it's a preview section, it's already got inbuilt textures for the scene world. And the textures are known as HDRIs. And HDRIs are basically high resolution image maps that have really high dynamic range colors and light information that can be used to light your scene. So to do that, we have to add a HDRI texture to our world. So in this world section, we need to add a environment texture. So to do that, we need to download a lighting scenario. So we can do that from our website. Inside Texture Haven, there's another website called HDRI Haven, and this has all kinds of textures that can be used for lighting information. They're basically panoramic photos, high resolution panoramic photos that give you different light information based on the photo. And the nice thing about this website is that it actually gives you a preview of how that light will work in 3D space. So based on this image, for instance, the strong sun is giving this strong shadow. And it's a warmer toned scene, so it's giving warmer tones. Whereas this one's a cooler scene, so it's giving cooler tones and softer shadows. So let's find something that's a bit nice. So I'm gonna go with let's go with this one, the Wooden Motel. I'll download that and you'll see these shadows will pop up when we bring it into 3D. And I'll download two. I'll download this small cathedral and I'll download this Wooden Motel. So you can choose different resolutions, but to make it easy, let's keep it at 2K. Let's download that, and you can see it's called HDRI. I'm going to put it into my texture folder. I'm going to do the same thing with this one. Save that. All right, and we're going to bring that into our 3D scene. Now to do that, we can do it through the world settings here, or we can do it through the shader editor, but in this case we have to switch it from object to world. And as you can see, there's nothing there at the moment because we have no nodes put into it. So let's add it from here. So we go to our color settings here, we push this little dot, and we select our environment texture. And usually when you're starting off in Blender, people get mixed up with just adding an image texture, thinking that that would be good enough, but it's not. The environment texture takes on the light information as well as the color information. So we click on environment texture and it goes pink. The reason it's going pink is because there's no texture attached yet. So we have to add one. So we go to open, navigate to our textures, and we will select our Wooden Motel HDRI. And as you can see, it's added that lighting information. If I delete these lights, you'll see that it has all the information it needs to light that scene. And it's even taking on some of those shadows as well. And if we could actually rotate that as well, and we'll get into that in a second. Look what happens when I add a different HDRI now. Let's add the small cathedral. It's changed the way the light behaves. But I'm going to go back to my wooden motel, and I want to get those shadows. And the reason why I'm not getting those shadows maybe is because of the direction of the setup. It might also just be because of the render settings that we have as well. Let's just make sure there's no lights in this scene. That's all good. All right, and you can see it's behaving differently, and the reflection changes as well. The reflection takes on the HDRI. So if we go to our world settings now and push full stop on our keyboard, you can see that we have our wooden texture. And now if we push Control T on this node, just Control T, we can add that mapping node back, and we can probably rotate the shadows. So if we click on this and put on the rotation on the mapping, you can rotate the image map. And you can see we're starting to get those shadows now. And we can make that floor texture a little less bumpy or less rough, or we can make it super rough to see those shadows. Like so. But yeah, that will do for today, I think. I just wanted to get through all this material stuff because next week we're going to start texturing our room a little bit, and it's better to talk about it now with these basic shapes and principles than later where it gets more complicated and we start working with more complicated sort of objects, because we need to unwrap those objects and to make sure that they look good. So yeah, does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? If not, we can move on, and we can talk next week as well. All right. If that's it, let's call it a day, and I'll catch you guys next week. Thanks for coming.